In 1804, a man named John Bell decided his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. So he, along with his wife Lucy and their 6 kids, packed all their belongings onto wagons and then traveled more than 600 miles west to this 1,000-acre patch along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled was known as Robertson County, and at the time, it was very rural and basically nobody lived there. And so the Bell family, when they arrived in Robertson County, fully expected to have to work with the few families that were there to build up the settlement. Basically, they wanted to build a town from scratch. But this was the kind of work that John Bell was born for. He was raised on a farm where he had a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up. John was very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, when his family was still in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife Lucy would open their door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal, and sometimes John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they were down on hard times. So, after arriving in Robertson County and after the Bell family had met their few neighbors, John Bell got right to work. First, he began clearing trees off of his land, and then with that lumber, he built a 1.5-story log house up on this hill not far from the Red River. And in fact, the Red River was a very popular picnic spot and fishing spot for the few people that lived in Robertson County, and so in virtue of the Bell's house being so near the river, the Bell family was always running into their neighbors and saying hi and making friends. And so it wasn't long after John and his family had arrived and built this house that the Bell family became one of the most popular families in the area. And for many years, the Bell family lived a very happy and prosperous life in Robertson County. Most mornings, John would wake up first, and then he would rouse the children, who would then leave the house and walk through the nearby woods to go to their school, and then they'd come back before sunset. And then while the kids were at school during the day, John and his older sons would go out and work the land or help build structures around town to build the settlement up, or they would build the boats that they would use to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down south for trade. John and Lucy would have 3 more kids while in Robertson County, and before long, their oldest children began getting married and starting families of their own and building their own houses nearby. But one summer day in 1817, so 13 years after the Bell family first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience that at the time he would completely write off. But years later, they would look back and say, that's when it started. On that summer day in 1817, John was by himself. He was out walking through his cornfield near his house when he looked out and he saw this big dog just sitting in the middle of the cornfield. Now, there were lots of dogs around Robertson County, so it wasn't unusual to run into a dog while you were out and about. But there was something off about this dog. It almost looked misshapen, like its bones had broken many times over and reset at awkward angles. And this dog just looked way too big to be a dog. It almost looked more like a big wolf. And this dog was staring at John in a very human way, not breaking eye contact, staring right at John. Now, John was not someone who easily spooked, but standing in this cornfield staring at this dog who was staring right back at him, John couldn't help but feel totally unsettled and a little bit panicked. And so John, who had his rifle with him, raised it and fired in the direction of this dog, and when he did, the dog took off running. And so John, he watched as this dog galloped away from him and disappeared into the tree line of the forest far away, and once the dog was totally out of view, John marched forward to the spot in the cornfield where this dog had been sitting. And when he got there, he was expecting to see the corn kind of pressed down from where this big animal had been sitting, but it wasn't. There was no sign that any big creature had been sitting right there. And as he looked around him, he saw there were no paw prints, no tracks on the ground, either coming to this spot or going in the direction that he watched this big dog run off. John was totally confused by this, but after sitting there kind of wondering how this could be, He just told himself, you know what, I'm overthinking this. It was just some big, ugly dog and a missed shot. This is no big deal. And so John promptly turned around and walked back to his house, forgetting all about the dog. But not long after John saw this dog in the cornfield, his family began experiencing other strange things back at their house. At night, after the Bell family had climbed into bed, they would start hearing a knocking sound on the side of their house. And as soon as they got up to go inspect it, the knocking would stop. And then they'd lay back down again, and they would hear it again, except it was coming from another side of the house. It was like there was someone or something outside of their house, just kind of circling around them, periodically knocking on their walls. Now, John was convinced this was not the work of some animal. This was a person, a prankster, and they were hiding out in the woods somewhere. And so he instructed his family not to mention the tapping sounds to anybody in town because he thought somebody in town was doing this to them, and he didn't want them to know that they were onto them. He wanted these pranksters to come back and do it again so he could catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued, and every time John would lay in wait and try to run out and see who was there, there'd be no one. And there'd be no tracks anywhere around the house indicating that anyone had ever been there. And as unsettling as these knocking sounds were for the family, they were nothing compared to the things that happened next. One Sunday night in May of 1818, so roughly 1 year after John had seen that big dog in the cornfield and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had begun in the Bell's household, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their bedroom inside of their home when they woke up to the sound of what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. Now, these boys were sleeping in 2 bunk beds, and the 2 oldest brothers were sleeping on the lower bunk. And so they instinctively got up, stepped onto the floor to go find this rat, but the second they stepped onto the floor, the gnawing sound completely disappeared. The 2 boys searched the room for this rat, they couldn't find it, and when they checked all of the bedposts, there was no sign that any of them had been gnawed on. So the 2 older brothers finally just kind of shrugged it off and climbed back in bed. The moment they closed their eyes, the gnawing sound began again. Except now it was louder and more frantic, like whatever was under there was desperately trying to chew through the wood of their beds. But again, when the 2 older brothers leapt out of their bed to go find whatever animal was doing this, the sound would completely stop and the room would go still. The boys searched the room again. There was no sign of any rat or any animal. There were no marks on the underside of their beds, and so they had no idea what to make of this. The gnawing sounds would continue all that night, making it nearly impossible for these boys to sleep, and it would happen again the next night the same way. But on the night after that, so the 3rd night, the boys heard a new sound in their room. As they're laying in their beds, exhausted from barely sleeping the last 2 nights, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air underneath their beds. Like they were being choked, they were gulping and smacking their lips and clawing at the underside of the beds. The 2 oldest boys were terrified, but eventually worked up the courage and leapt from their bed to confront whatever was underneath them. But again, as soon as their feet hit the floor, the sounds completely stopped and the room went still. But this time, the boys were so frightened, they decided not to try to just go back to sleep. Instead, they woke up the rest of their family, and the Bell family searched the entire house, top to bottom, looking for any indication of what could have been making those sounds, but there was nothing in their house. There was no marks from some animal or rat. I mean, there was no indication that anything was other than normal. Now, to this point, the Bell family had not told anybody in town about either the knocking sounds on the walls, or the rat gnawing sounds, or now the gulping for air sounds. And a part of that was because John had told the family, don't tell anyone because we're going to catch whoever's doing this. But another part of it was the family knew as soon as they brought this stuff up, they could be the target of ridicule because people wouldn't believe them. But after this night with the gulping and gasping sounds, the Bell kids really could not sleep anymore. They were just up all night, terrified. And so finally, John went to one of his neighbors who he was very close with and confided in him that something weird was happening inside of his house. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was very straightforward, very honest. He didn't even tell jokes. And so this neighbor, as he's listening to this unbelievable story, just takes John at face value and says, you know what? I'll stay the night in your house and I'll see if I can hear all these strange sounds. That night, the neighbor would stay with John Bell and his family in the Bell household, and sure enough, the neighbor would hear the tapping on the walls, he would hear the rat gnawing on the wood post in the boys' room, as well as that gasping and gulping sound coming from the boys' room, and this neighbor was so terrified that he did not last the night in John's house. He left in the middle of the night to go back to his house. After this, word spread quickly around Robertson County about what was happening at the Bell household, and the way the townspeople reacted was very supportive. I mean, the Bell family had been instrumental in building up the settlement, and John and his wife Lucy were so kind and generous, and so the townspeople decided that they were going to find a way to rally around the Bell family and try to help them. So other people in town began volunteering to spend the night inside of the Bell household with the Bell family. One, because they wanted the Bell family to feel some security, having some more people around them. And two, these people were thinking that maybe just their presence inside of the Bell household would scare off whoever or whatever was tormenting the Bells. But no matter who stayed inside of the Bell household, the noises persisted every single night. Townspeople came up with all sorts of explanations for what was happening to the Bell family, ranging from, John's youngest daughter must be behind this because she wants attention, or other people said maybe there's a family or an individual that hates the Bell family and they're targeting them and they're behind this. There was even a theory that someone in town had learned ventriloquism, which is a kind of performance where the ventriloquist throws their voice so it sounds like it's coming from somewhere else, not from their body. And so the idea was this ventriloquist was just a prankster and they were screwing with the Bell family. But the townspeople searched the Bell's house with the Bell family over and over again, and they never found any sign of what could be making these noises. The people in town even went so far as to have people watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night to make sure none of them were responsible for these sounds. And sure enough, as the Bell family was being closely monitored, the noises would start, and it was very clearly not coming from anyone in the Bell family. As the months went on, and the Bell family was forced to endure whatever was going on inside of their home, the people in town started to notice something odd about John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged person, that when he spoke to you, he was locked onto you and really paying attention. But at some point, after these mysterious things began happening at his house, John would be talking to someone, and then suddenly his eyes would kind of gloss over and his jaw would go slack, and it would look like he was staring off into the distance. And then his face would start to twitch. And at first, these twitches were fairly minor and were centered just around his eyes. But over time, these twitches became much more dramatic, to the point where his jaw would start to kind of quiver up and down, and his eyes would begin blinking out of sync. And then when the twitching finally stopped, John, without saying a word to the person he had just been talking to, would just wander back to his house. He'd go up to his bedroom and he would sit on his bed for hours and hours and hours, just staring at the wall, not eating, not drinking, not saying anything. The Bell family felt like they were hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these things to happen or why they were happening, and they were all filled with this constant sense of dread. As for the townspeople, most of them had come to believe that whatever was happening to the Bell family was likely caused by their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was known to be very eccentric and kind of unpleasant, and she was known to be fairly unlucky, because her husband had become disabled and her 3 kids had all died young. Kate also had this strange habit of using really big, complex words in her conversations, but she misused the words, and so everything she said kind of sounded off. Townspeople would talk about Kate Batts' witch, and they started referring to whatever was causing the strange phenomenon at the Bell household as just Kate. However, when Kate found out about this, she was totally offended and said she had nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying happenings at the Bell household had been going on for 3 years, and somehow the Bell family had just learned to live with it. However, John Bell was not doing good. It was like the longer these strange things were happening, the more and more John seemed to become a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and twitching fits began to happen more and more frequently, and the time he would spend afterwards sitting in his bedroom staring at the wall in silence would go on longer and longer and longer. In private, John would tell his wife, Lucy, that he believed someone or something was torturing him to death. And then one day, as John was getting sicker and sicker, one of his daughters, Esther, left the house to go gather up some eggs in the hen house, which was across the lane from where the Bell house was. And so she left the house, she crossed over the road, she began walking up towards this hen house, and as she was walking, she heard what sounded like someone moving behind her. And so she turned around, and she saw there was this woman dressed all in black with her head down, walking slowly down the road she had just walked on towards her house. So she's basically walking exactly where Esther had just come from, but Esther had not seen her until just now. So she wasn't really sure how this woman had arrived on the road, but Esther wasn't worried. She looked at this woman, she didn't recognize her, but just assumed she was somebody from town, and that was it. And so Esther turned away from this woman and walked the rest of the way up to the hen house. She went inside, she got the eggs in her basket, and then when she came back outside again and she was back on that road, now facing in the direction of her house, she saw this woman in black with her head down was still trudging along slowly, now much closer to the Bell household. And so Esther, she began walking down the road, looking at this woman, trying to figure out who she was. And as she got closer and closer, she realized she recognized her as somebody from the village. This was a neighbor of hers. And so Esther yelled out a friendly hello. But this woman in black with her head down didn't turn around, she didn't react, she just kept on slowly walking down the lane towards the Bell house. And so Esther began walking a little bit faster, getting closer and closer to this woman, and she yelled out a few more times, "Hey, hello, how are you?" But each time, this woman in black just appeared not to hear Esther. And Esther, she's looking around, and there's nobody else out. It's just her and this woman who's now about 15 feet away from her. And so Esther starts to feel really uncomfortable about this woman. And so Esther just stops on the road and stares at the back of this woman. And the second Esther stopped, this woman who was trudging along also suddenly stopped. And then she reached up with her hands, her back is still to Esther, and she took her bonnet off of her head. A bonnet is a type of hat. And then she dropped the bonnet on the ground, and right away this woman's black matted hair kind of tumbled down over her back. And then this woman, without moving, began reaching up and stroking her hair, running her fingers through her hair as if she was trying to comb it out. And so Esther is watching this, kind of wondering what's going on here. And so Esther began walking slowly closer and closer to this woman to make sure she was okay. But with each step that Esther took towards this woman began running her hands faster and faster through her hair until it almost looked impossible. She was moving so fast. And then Esther realized with horror that she wasn't just combing her hair. This woman was grabbing clumps of her hair and pulling them out of her head. In fact, Esther could literally hear the hair being ripped from this woman's scalp. And so before long, there was hair all over the ground around this woman. And so Esther at this point is terrified. She thinks there's something wrong with this woman. And so she runs around this woman without looking at her, charges into her house, which is right in front of this lady. She goes inside, she locks the door behind her. And then Esther calls out for one of her sisters who was home and said, come here, come here. And the two of them went to the front window and they look out onto the road and they see the woman. She's still there in the same spot, ripping her hair out. But Esther makes eye contact with this woman. And the second that happens, the woman freezes. Her hands are still in her hair and she's looking directly up at Esther. And Esther and her sister, they're kind of taken aback by the way this woman is looking at them. And then this woman slowly brings her hands down and she's staring up at Esther the whole time. and then she turns suddenly and walks around the side of the property out of view of Esther and her sister. And so Esther and her sister, they shriek, they leave the front window and they run over to the side window where this woman was heading, and they saw this woman climbing up and over their fence, getting into their side property, and behind her were now 3 children who they had not seen before, just marching right behind this woman in black. And so this woman and these 3 children, in plain sight of Esther and her sister, they walk into this grove of trees on the Bell property. And so Esther and her sister, they're just staring. They have no idea what's happening. And then one by one, the woman first, then each of the children climbed their own trees. And then once all 4 of them were up in these trees, they turned around so they were all looking directly at Esther and her sister. And then they all began swaying with their bodies in the trees, getting these trees to bend and wave hard left and right. And so Esther and her sister are horrified, and as they're staring, Esther's husband just happens to come through the front door. And so Esther yells for him to come over here and look out the window, look what they're doing out there. And so Esther's husband, he runs over to the window and he looks out, but he can't see the woman or the 3 kids. He can only see trees swaying unnaturally left and right. And so Esther and her sister, they realize he's not seeing what we're seeing, what's happening. And before long, they're screaming. The husband's trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the trio just ran from the window, went out the back door, and ran around to the side yard to go confront this woman and these children. But when they got out to the grove of trees, the woman, the kids, they were gone, and there was no tracks anywhere on the ground to indicate that anybody had been there recently. Not long after this incident, sometime in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. And as they walked, suddenly John stopped and threw his hands up to his face as if he was protecting himself from someone trying to hit him. And then all of a sudden, John's face just went totally slack, and his body began to contort into these horrible, grotesque angles, and his back began to arch so far it looked like his back would break. And so John's son, he's watching this happen. He has no idea what to do. And so he just runs over and grabs his dad and tries to pull him upright. And as he does this, this horrifying shriek fills the air. John's son has no idea where it's coming from, but it's so loud it stops him in his tracks. And then as fast as all of this had happened, it all stopped. John was back to normal, laying on the ground, coming to, and the shrieking was gone. It was silent on their farm. And so John's son turns to his dad, and he sees John is crying on the ground. And he says to his son, "I don't have much time left." John's son would help him up, and then the 2 of them silently just walked back to the house, and John went straight to bed. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come down for breakfast, and so his family went up to his bedroom to make sure he was okay. But when they found him, he was still laying in bed, he was breathing, but no matter what they did, they couldn't wake him up. And so one of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet inside of their house, but when he opened it up, all the medicine was gone, and in their place was this strange glass vial that contained a smoky, dark liquid that the son had never seen before and no one in the family had seen before. And so the family immediately called for a doctor to come to their house, both for John and also to see what this liquid was. And so the doctor showed up. He didn't really know what to do for John. It didn't make sense that he just was not waking up. And then the doctor checked on this liquid and he said, "You need to test this on some farm animals to make sure we know what it does." And so the family went out and found a stray cat and they force-fed it some of this liquid. And within minutes, the cat had died. The Bell family swore they had not put that vial in the medicine cabinet. They had no idea what it was or how it got there. As for John, he would not wake up that day, and in fact, the following morning when he was still in bed, he died. After John's death, the strange occurrences at the Bell household basically all came to a stop, for the most part. Some people in town reported, after John's death, seeing strange lights floating around the Bell property, and also sometimes they reported hearing a strange sing-song voice kind of coming from somewhere out around their property. John's wife, Lucy, would remain inside of that house until 1838, when she passed away. Today, there's nothing left of the Bell household. However, there is a cave on their property, an underground cave, and people swear that's where whatever tormented the Bells came from. Fiance Mike Monahan in Arlington, Massachusetts. The couple had been together for 10 years, and their family said they really loved each other and they were a great couple. In July of that year, Jeannie and Mike left for a planned trip to Yosemite National Park in California to go backpacking and sightseeing. On July 9th, the couple arrived at Yosemite and they entered via this road that was only open during the summer. So as such, it was totally desolate and they were the only ones on this road. And they had about a 2.5 hour drive until they reached the spot they were going to actually stop at. So they had the scenic drive up the road, and about 2 hours into this drive, there was this turnout on the side of the road where a couple of other tourists were standing and sightseeing, and Jeannie and Mike decided they wanted to pull over and get out and stretch their legs. So they pulled over in the turnout, and when they got out, Mike said he wanted to walk down the trail a little ways to this area that apparently was good for bird watching. And Jeannie didn't want to do that. She wanted to walk in the other direction up to this overlook. And so they decided that they would each get to do their own activities. They'd be gone for 15 minutes and then meet back at the car. So Mike heads down and does his bird watching. And then after 15 minutes, he walks back up to the car expecting to see Jeannie, but she's not there. And this is 1995. Neither of them had a cell phone. And so he can't just call her. And so he just stands by the car and waits. And so he's looking around, waiting for her to reemerge out of the trail she had left on. But after 15 more minutes goes by and he still hasn't seen her, he walks up to some of the tourists that were there in the first place. And he asked them, hey, have you seen this woman Jeannie? And he described what she looked like. And they said, no, we haven't seen her. And so he goes back to the car and now he's getting pretty anxious and he's looking around and he's just waiting for her to show up. And another 15 minutes goes by. So now she's 30 minutes late and he starts walking up the trail to see if he can find her. But he realizes the trail immediately spiders off in different directions. And so she could have gone in any one of these different pathways. And so at this point, he decides, I have to get authorities involved. Time is of the essence. And so he runs back to his car and he sees a Park Service employee emptying a trash can into a dumpster. And so he runs over to them and he says, you know, my fiance, Jeannie, she's gone. She's been gone for 30 minutes. Can you please get in touch with authorities and get people up here looking for her? Within 45 minutes of speaking to this employee, park rangers had made their way up to this area and they began talking to Mike and figuring out where she might have gone. And they start walking down the trail to look for her. But after an hour of not finding her, the park rangers would call in additional assistance from the police. The search for Jeannie would become the largest in Yosemite's history, expanding to 40 square miles with helicopters overhead and dog handlers on the ground and hundreds of volunteers combing this whole area. But despite the relatively quick response time and massive amount of manpower, they could not find Jeannie. After 2 weeks of looking everywhere for her, the only thing they were able to find were 2 boot prints that they believed belonged to Jeannie. The first print was found in the vicinity of where their car was parked, so where she had actually disappeared from. And then the other one was curiously located on a trail that was one of the biggest trails in Yosemite. It was very well marked, it was fairly wide. You're not going to mistake this for anything other than a trail. And the boot print was not walking along the trail. It was cutting across it, as if she was going from woodline, crossing over the trail into the other woodline. This second print didn't make any sense to authorities because they're thinking, you know, if you're lost out in the middle of the woods and you come across a clearly defined trail, a really obvious trail, you wouldn't walk across it and go back into the woods. You would take the trail in either direction until it hits civilization, because all trails do that for the most part. And so it seemed like this print could not be hers, because that would indicate she has chosen not to follow this path. But the print was hers. Over the course of these 2 weeks of searching, several dog teams had been placed right where Mike's car had been, right where Jeannie had left to go to the trail where she disappeared. And the dogs could not pick up a scent of Jeannie. And it led the handlers to believe that Mike was actually lying and that Jeannie had actually never been in Yosemite. And this was all a big ploy because he had done something to her and he was going to act like she's lost in the wilderness and he was going to get away with whatever he did to her. And so ultimately the FBI got involved because now foul play is being suggested. And the first thing the FBI did is they polygraphed Mike. and he passed without question, and he was totally vindicated of any involvement. After that, the FBI dug into Mike's background and Jeannie's background to see if there was any indication of somebody that might want to do Jeannie harm, and they couldn't find anything. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened to her. On September 3rd, so 2 months after Jeannie went missing, 2 men were in this really remote section of Yosemite to go fishing when they spotted a human body in a pool of water. It would turn out to be Jeannie's. She was 3 miles from where she was last seen by Mike at that trailhead. She was only wearing socks and 1 boot, and she had been sitting in this pool of water for so long that they were unable to determine a cause of death. Initially, it was speculated that she must have fallen into the river that fed ultimately down to where she was found. She must have fallen into that river, miles away, close to where she went missing. Maybe she fell and hit her head and was unconscious, and then she drowned, and then she wound up here. But park officials said there's too many debris along this waterway that her body would never have been able to get down to this spot. But if she didn't drift to that spot, it meant she had to have gotten there on foot. And to get to this particular spot, according to the fishermen that were interviewed after they found her, the only way to get there is to climb up a cliff with climbing gear on, or scale down a cliff, again, with climbing gear on. The only people that go fishing in this area are mountain climbers and rock climbers that have the equipment to get there. From where Jeannie went missing, she would have had to climb down 2,000 feet of cliff face to get to this spot, and she did not have climbing gear. And so when that seemed really unlikely, the next theory was, okay, she must have been abducted and they brought her here. But that means your assailant would have had to carry Jeannie down this 2,000-foot cliff, which also seems really unrealistic. The most widely accepted theory was put forth by a tracker that was involved in this case. They went out and they surveyed the area where Jeannie would have been, and they noticed that the sound the wind made when it passed by this particular clump of aspen trees, when the wind hit the leaves in the trees, it sounded like a car driving by. And so they speculated that maybe, Jeannie, she's scared, she's panicking, it's nighttime, and she hears this sound and she thinks she's hearing a road. And so she would have walked towards the sound of, the car, which really was the leaves, and she would have disregarded, for example, the trail. She would have walked over the trail because she's trying to get down to this road. She's kind of fixated on this road. And at some point, she could have potentially wound up at the side of that cliff that would have led down to where she was found. And then she could have slipped and fallen over the edge and landed in one of the rivers that would have flowed down to where she was found. But park officials and authorities were a little bit skeptical of this theory because for her to have landed in a stretch of water that did connect to where she was found, it was almost like she would have had to leap off the cliff to land in that stretch of water. It wouldn't have been just falling over the edge and then you're landing in this water. It would have been more of a jump to get to it. So the idea that, Jeannie is running and leaping off cliffs, that doesn't really add up either. But park officials and authorities, they don't have a better theory. In fact, no one has a better theory. We're just left with a lot of questions, like how did she wind up in this inaccessible area? Why didn't the dogs pick up her scent? Why didn't she take that trail down to safety? Why did she cross over it? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know the answer. On September 19th, 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again, probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. Barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The 2 women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st. But when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up. And for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and, called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these 2 women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip. And the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their 2 dogs who were alive, they were okay, and in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones. But there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not 2 older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these 2 women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those 2 dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well, and she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the 2 women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these 2 women abandoned their 2 dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance. And since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park. And there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes. On March 7th, 1975, 21-year-old Mark Hansen, along with 2 of his friends from college, Ben Fish and John Chidester, arrived at a parking lot on the eastern side of the Appalachian Trail. All 3 of the young men were in incredible physical shape and were excited to spend their spring break challenging themselves on some of the trail's most rigorous hikes. The day before they were supposed to go, they almost canceled the trip because there was this terrible weather system that was coming over the trail. And they were thinking, it's going to be dangerous. It's not such a good idea. And then they started talking some more and they were like, well, we're already going to, challenge ourselves. It would be even more challenging to hike these really difficult trails with the inclusion of bad weather. So this is another way to, test our abilities. And so they kind of got pumped up at the idea of hiking the Appalachian Trail in terrible weather. So the guys arrive in the parking lot, the windshield wipers are furiously working to keep the pouring rain off. They hop out and they're getting soaked by the rain. They put on their ponchos, they grab their heavy packs, and they make their way over to the trail. Their plan was to move west along the trail until they hit the Tri-Corner Shelter, where they would spend their first night. The Tri-Corner Shelter is one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. They are open to the public. There's no heating or electricity, but it provides shelter from the storm. You can go in there and, get in a sleeping bag and you'll be fine. But to get to the Tri-Corner Shelter, they would need to hike 16 miles, almost completely uphill, walking right into the wind, and it's raining on them, and it's supposed to snow later on. So it's just a treacherous first day. But they take off, they start walking up this trail, and after a couple of miles, John says, you know what, guys, this is awful. I think we should probably turn around. I think we've underestimated how bad this is going to be. Let's go back to the car and we'll do this another time. But Mark and Ben were like, oh no, we are committed. We are doing this. We are not turning around. And John's like, you know what? Suit yourself. I'm not going to do that. And he turned around and he left, and he went back to the car, and he would pick them up when they were done. After John turned around, Mark and Ben, they felt good. They felt tough. They're going to stick this hike out. And so they take off again, and Ben's in the lead, and Ben seems to be handling the poor weather and difficult hike and heavy pack a lot better than Mark is. In fact, over the next several hours, Mark would drift farther and farther back, and Ben would need to wait for him, and Mark would be hunched over, really just struggling with this hike. And then at some point, Mark yells to him and says, I gotta take my pack off. I can't carry this much weight up this hill until we get to the shelter. I'm not gonna make it to the shelter. And Ben would say to him, if we don't get to the shelter for some reason, you're going to be stranded out here in this storm without any warm clothes, without your sleeping bag, without your tent, without your food, without your water. It's way too dangerous. You have to keep your pack on. And so finally, Mark is convinced, and he's like, oh, all right, puts his pack back on, and they continue moving. About an hour later, at 7 p.m., they had reached the section of the trail where they knew they were getting close-ish to the Tri-Corner Shelter. They were certainly well beyond the halfway point, but it was dark out. The temperature had dropped significantly. At this point, Ben is basically Mark's cheerleader, kind of egging him on to keep moving, and Mark's kind of staggering along this trail, and Ben and Mark are just hoping that shelter just appears at some point here because they don't know how much farther they can go. Another hour and a half goes by. They still haven't made it to the shelter. Mark is groaning. He can barely move. It's pitch black. The rain has now completely shifted over to snow, and it is just dumping snow on them. And Ben is concerned that, somehow did we take a wrong turn, even though they were on a really well-marked trail, and he knew they hadn't. He figured they must be so close at this point. And it was around this time that Mark yells out to Ben, I'm done. I can't go any farther. And he sits down right in the middle of the trail. He's sitting down with his pack, and he's just laying there, and Ben is like, come on, we're so close. You can't sit down now. And Mark's like, I'm not moving. I can't do any more. I'm going to sleep right here. Ben knows this is a bad idea. I mean, they did have warm clothes and sleeping bags, and they probably would be just fine sleeping out in the middle of the trail, but it just seemed so unnecessarily risky when there's probably a shelter maybe a couple hundred meters away, and he would turn out to be right. And so he decides he's going to walk ahead on the trail, and he's going to see if the shelter's there, but he only went about 100 meters. He was within maybe 100 meters of the actual shelter, but he never saw it. And so after going ahead and feeling like, man, I don't want to drag Mark any farther, if there's no shelter ahead, for all we know, we took a wrong turn. And so he turns back around, and he goes back near Mark, not next to him, but close enough to him that he can see him. And he sits down on the trail too. He gets his sleeping bag out, he crawls inside, and he falls asleep. That night, Ben would have this vivid, horrible nightmare where he heard Mark screaming for help, yelling for Ben to come save him as he's being dragged off the trail into the forest. And it scared him so much that Ben woke up, and he looks down the trail to where Mark is, and he can see Mark's backpack is sitting right on the trail. And so he thinks, oh, Mark's still there. And he's so tired, he's not about to get up and go check. He's like, that was just a dream. And he goes back to sleep. The next morning, when the sun comes up, Ben gets up again. And the first thing he does is he looks over at Mark, and he sees the pack. But he realizes that Mark is not there. It's just the backpack. And so Ben jumps up and he yells for Mark. He doesn't get a response. He's looking around thinking he's got to be around here, but He's not. It snowed that night, so any tracks Mark would have left to show where he went to were now covered up. And that's when it dawns on Ben that that dream he had the night before, that might have been real. And he has this sinking feeling that something horrible has happened to Mark and that he didn't save him. And so he thinks, I gotta get authorities. He grabs his bag. He leaves Mark's there because he's thinking maybe he'll come back and he'll grab it. And Ben turns and runs down the trail in the direction he hopes is towards this tri-corner shelter. And he can't believe it when literally 200 meters away, he finds the tri-corner shelter. They were that close. And inside are other hikers. He was able to get one of them to run down and get Park Services to know that they have a missing hiker on the trail. Searchers were dispatched to the area where Mark and Ben had been sleeping on the trail. The first thing they did is they went to his bag, and inside were all the things he would need to survive out in the wild. His tent, his warm clothes, his sleeping bag, his food, his water, everything. It was all left there. Over the next few days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They had helicopters overhead, and they made no significant discovery. However, one park ranger discovered this huge cave that was not that far away from where they had been sleeping. And inside of this cave, this ranger said a large mammal had been staying recently. It was not there now. And there was all these animal bones inside the cave. So it was obviously a predator of some kind. And so there was speculation that between this cave that probably held, a bear or something like that, and Ben's dream that probably was reality of Mark being pulled off the trail screaming for help, that maybe Mark was attacked by some animal that dragged him away. On the 9th day of the search, Mark's body was found. It was located 3 miles down the hill from where he and Ben had been sleeping up on that trail. Mark was positioned up against a tree. His jacket was open, his gloves were off, and his boots were off, and they were placed right next to him. An autopsy concluded he must have died within 24 to 36 hours of leaving that trail. So there's lots of questions with this one, namely, why did Mark, in the middle of the night, get up, not tell Ben where he was going, and then leave the trail and walk 3 miles away? The trail they were on was very well worn, that even at night in a snowstorm, it would be very obvious if you were on the trail or if you were off the trail. If you look at this picture, this is a section of the trail they were on. This is not the literal place they were at, but this is a good representation. As you can clearly see, there is a trail that runs down the middle, and then there is the forest to the side of that trail. That if you were to leave the trail, you'd be bumping into trees left and right. It would be very obvious you were off the trail. So Mark had to have known he was leaving the trail. But even if Mark had a great reason for wanting to leave the trail, just hours earlier, he couldn't even stand. That's why they were even laying on the trail to begin with, because he couldn't go any farther. So the idea that he can just jump up in the middle of the night and navigate this really difficult terrain for 3 miles in total darkness in the snow, that doesn't make sense either. And then you have Ben's dream, where he hears Mark screaming for help, and he's yelling for Ben to come save him as he's getting dragged off the trail. There's a good chance what Ben was hearing and seeing in his dream was actually playing out just several feet away from him down the trail. So David Paulides and the other people involved in this search, they all believe the key to understanding what happened to Mark is what caused him to scream for help and potentially what pulled him off the trail and dragged him 3 miles away.